This summer I had the opportunity to visit the Willamette Valley in Oregon to see where the majority of grass seed is produced in this country. I learned so many different things on this trip and the ins and outs of how much goes into a seed before it's even put into the ground and then ultimately comes to your house to be planted as a lawn. So there's so much information in here, I don't want to cut out too much of it. It's definitely going to be a multi-part series. I will create a playlist for this if you want to follow along so that you can watch the whole series. On this first video we're going to talk about plant genetics, and I got to visit with a breeder who actually comes up with different varieties. They test all these varieties. We're going to talk about so many things in that process and how all that works. So without further ado, let's get to that.
Takes anywhere if you fast track it, 7 years to 15 years. So it's ready to give to someone like TMI. We go through multiple cycles of what we call recurrent phenotypic and genotypic selection. So we're selecting for plant type, color, texture, seed yield, and we do that all across the country, not just here in Oregon, because Oregon is a very mild climate. So these grasses, and this is something that's very unique to grass seed in that industry, is that we are looking at a crop that has to perform all across the United States and even into Europe. When you go to other crops like corn, soybeans, they're very specific to regions. We don't do that with grass seed. Mm-hmm. So we have to test everywhere across the country that we can afford because we have to get into those stress climates. This is an older trial, and you can see by the round circles, that's the corner. This is a perennial ryegrass trial. It's been in here for 4 years now. You can see even in Oregon, where we have a mild climate, that some of these grasses have some problems. You can see as far as color, we're pretty uniform in color. And I know that when we talk about turf grasses and what is a healthy grass, we always gravitate to the darkest green color. But you can see in this particular trial here, there are 111 different cultivars or experimental lines. You don't see 111 different colors of grass. You only see a few that are a little bit darker, but most of them are roughly in the same hue. And that has a lot to do with breeding. You reach a threshold, okay? And when it comes to color, because we've been breeding for color for a long time, not just ourselves, but all the breeders in the industry, and you reach a certain threshold. You can't get them any darker. Then you start going the opposite direction as far as they get too much anthocyanins, and then you start making deleterious type of effects with that. So we've reached a really even plateau with color. So color is not, shouldn't be your number one criteria when you're selecting a cultivar for a home lawn, athletic fields, etc. It should be the attributes that go with those grasses. Here we're looking at how long the grasses have been in this trial. Do they still have good density? Do they still have a uniform appearance? How much stress has happened to this grass to thin it out? So those are the type of things that we're looking for. So those are the attributes that we want. You do see the skirting on this trial is much darker than the trial itself. The skirting is what we call it's a tetraploid perennial ryegrass, so it's still perennial ryegrass. We've just doubled the chromosome number. And it gives it a nice sheen and a dark green color. Yeah. And that was developed here at NexGen. We have a patent on that. This specific trial is part of the Cooperative Turfgrass Breeders Test. So we have a group of turfgrass breeders here in the valley, and we all work cooperatively to trial our varieties across the U.S. So this trial is duplicated in 14 other locations across the U.S. In all of our trials here at NexGen, we are taking digital photographs of these plots, and I'll show you how they do that in a minute. We'll get to that. And so we can quantify objectively the density, the color, the uniformity, the overall turf quality. So we can pick up if a if there's any disease stress going on. We can also do percent cover. So this particular trial has been under drought stress during the summers, so we can watch the disappearance of green over time. And so that can also be done with disease trials, herbicide trials, that sort of thing. So we can really put numbers to which cultivars are staying greener longer under whatever stress they're under. We didn't develop the light box, but we did improve the looks of it. So it has an app that we have on our phone, it hooks to the camera, which is on the top. The angle of the sun, the amount of cloud cover you have, the sun, going in and out of sun cover or cloud cover, really makes a difference on how you look at the turf and how you would rate it. In the past, when researchers would rate turf grasses, they would give it a subjective score on a 1 to 9 scale. Nobody can agree on the same scale, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were to walk it and score them yourself, each of you would come up with different answers.
Right.
With the camera, it gives you exactly what that plot is. We have a uniform lighting. It's the same over the course of taking those photos day after day after day. We also have then a digital record. If there's a question about where somebody's cultivar performed, it's not how we rated it. This is what the camera says. This is so it's very quantitative, and it takes that subjectivity out of it. So we always take photos the day after we mow. So we mowed yesterday, we'll take photos today. On these trials, we'll take photos once a week and just watch the decline of green cover. These are all 2-year-old trials. We'll leave them in for 3 years. And then we will pull out or make selections out of the plots that have the best performing drought tolerance. So we just have a simple dolly on the back. We've cut the lip off and have attached the box. And you see the lights on the inside. And we just strap on the camera to the top, size the aperture opening, so it is inside, doesn't hit the side of the box. We keep track of when the lights, the bulbs were changed, so we change those all the time. We have to set a white balance on the camera, so we get a nice uniform picture. So then they'll go in and we'll drop the pictures in Analyzer, and then it does all the work in a matter of seconds, and it'll give us turf quality, uniformity, density, color.
That's awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah. We want to be able to find the cream of the crop. Right. So if we come in and if something like Pythium or something comes in, we'll treat that because that's not the stress that we want to observe, like in a drought trial. Okay. But if it's just summer stress or things that are not going to compromise the trial, we'll just let that work. So in our New Jersey trials, whatever happens during the course of the summer in New Jersey with that heat, humidity, we just let it go because we want to see what will persist over time in those locations. Because when it comes to the homeowner or athletic fields, that's what they're looking for. They need a grass that's going to persist over time. So there are fewer inputs. If a cultivar has all of the best attributes that you can imagine, it's drought tolerance, it's disease resistant, it has the best turf quality, but a grower won't produce it because it doesn't make any seed. We screen all of our material for yield. So each row is a different cultivar, and each line is a rep. This is perennial ryegrass. There's 177 entries in this yield trial. Very labor intensive because we cut all of these by hand and then clean them, weigh them. And then we look at yield as percent of a check. So we take a well-known cultivar and it's replicated in here several times because we have the yield history for that variety. And then we can look at percent of how we're doing to that check. Are we so much above or are we well below it? So this way we can take a look at material that is moving towards that final stages And then we can say, okay, yes, it's going to make it for yield, or no, and we just scrap that, and it goes to the waste bin, so to speak. So we have some tall fescue in the back, perennial ryegrass here, and then next year we're screening fine fescues. So this is a very important component, again, of that breeding cycle. So we've put our plants out in what we call nurseries, plant selection field nurseries. We look at them on single plant basis to make our new crosses. After we make the cross and harvest the seed, that goes to turf trials. We look at it in turf trials. Is it doing very well? If it is, then we bring it back and start the cycle over, and we look at yield, and we just keep that cycle over and over and over until we find something that is rising to the top for whatever attribute, and start bringing that forward. And like I said, it's a 7 to 15 year circle before things start moving out. So it's very labor intensive.
As we get finer and we improve turf quality and especially color, and we make finer leaf texture, what typically happens is you're trying to find that balance between yield and all those improvements. And as the finer we get, typically what we lose is on the yield side, and there are those rare occasions where you find that one that has a good balance of all of it. But this has got to be a balance where you take everything into account. We can't just make the darkest, greenest, finest variety, because then we can never produce it. And then if we don't produce it, what was the point of making it? So
with perennial ryegrass, one of the biggest issues that the end user has is in the spring it gets very stemmy. You probably had some questions on that. Why does my turf look like this in the spring?
Right.
And it does go out. Plants want to reproduce. They want to grow up, put out seed heads, and reproduce itself. And so that's what it's doing. And when we select away from that, we are selecting away from seed yield. And when the golf industry was at its prime in the 90s, we really selected hard for, getting away from that stemmy turf. And so that really diminished our seed yield. And then as farmers needed, there needed to be a better payback for them, they wouldn't grow those varieties any longer. So we really had to select for higher seed yield and as much as we can for fewer stems in the spring.
My neighbor's cutting his at like 3 inches, and so it's definitely into that.
and you're cutting every day.
Yeah,
and he's
every
cutting
other day.
probably once, maybe twice a week, which allows that plant to start wanting to enter that reproductive mode.
Right.
So perennial ryegrass, a perfect case scenario for a grower is it's in the ground for 3 years, and they make their money back in year 2, year 3. And what's happened is with perennial ryegrass specifically, we're now seeing 2 years as more of the average as far as its lifespan in the ground. So now breeding efforts is how can we find a plant that has survivability for that 3rd year, which is a big deal to growers. And they also have to be able to take herbicide treatments. And that's the thing that where we're seeing probably the worst as far as that 3rd year. The plant's still there, but your seed yield diminishes so much that it's not worth it to have it in the ground. So we have to have plants that can take herbicide treatment in the production fields and still have seed yieldability and survivability for that 3rd year. So that's the other breeding side. She's not only breeding for the end user, her job would be a heck of a lot easier if she didn't have to focus on seed yield. She'd be like,
That's right.
We can make them really dark and fine all day, but bringing the fine and dark, survivability, the whole disease package, drought tolerance. Oh, and by the way, we got to make sure these growers are happy out here or we don't have a seed industry.
When you're cropping, which is very, very different, you're in rows, and you need that space to let these plants grow up. When you're in a blanket of turf, you have a lot of competition, and you are also going to have a lot of other things in there besides just your one crop. You have to make sure that you allow all of that to come up at once. Otherwise, you'll get pollination at different times. You won't get seed set or very little seed set.
That's the biggest deal that she keyed in on was pollination. Is typically right before it's about to pollinate, a homeowner might go in and mow and set that back
Right.
And then all of a sudden, yeah, it comes up, and some of it has got seed heads, but then some of it doesn't, and some of it's ready to pollinate, half of it isn't. Where growers, we don't cut. You know, it's brought up, it goes through fall, it goes through winter, it goes through spring, it throws seed head, we pollinate, we have seed. There's no cutting until we go to harvest.
But it's not true of like someone who says, oh, the grass in your yard is completely sterile, or like it couldn't grow.
No. The grasses that you work with in cool season grasses, they're open pollinated. Each cultivar is a population, okay? So they're not genetic clones of each other, they're a population. So each seed, each plant has slight variations, even though they're closely related. There's slight variations, so they're able to grow up and interpollinate and make seed. If you take a plant of ryegrass and you cut it into a lot of pieces and you have the same genetics, then you won't get pollination.
Okay. So like our production field for perennial ryegrass, kind of an average per acre is 10 pounds per acre is what we plant. So then the average homeowner's planting 10 pounds per thousand.
Right.
So that's why we can
your population's very different.
Yeah. So that's just part one. Stay tuned for part two, where we're going to dive into much more of this coming up very soon. Like I said, I'll have a playlist so you can follow along with all this. Thanks so much for watching today. We'll see you next time.